Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. In a city where Democrats hold a 5-to-1 edge in party registration, we seem poised to elect a Republican for the 4th consecutive mayoral election. While self-appointed pundits, including me, should always remember the 1948 Chicago Tribune headline proclaiming Dewey beats Truman, Fernando Ferrer appears to need something akin to a miraculous Hail Mary pass to overcome the lead that incumbent Michael Bloomberg has built up in pre-election polls. Those are the same polls that a year ago showed the mayor to be unpopular and running behind Ferrer. What happened? While some of Ferrer's problems appear self-inflicted, as is the case with all candidates facing a voracious news media looking for something to jump on, he also faces a confluence of factors that made an uphill battle more like mountain climbing. The city is in a state of relative calm, crime has continued to drop, and at least in the English language media, there has been a dearth of coverage of the kinds of policy pronouncements Ferrer has regularly trotted out on taxes, affordable housing, and other issues. And then there is the astonishing amount of his personal wealth that the mayor is pouring into his campaign, whether it's 70 million or 100 million or whatever other number it ends up being. Bloomberg's spending has dwarfed the very underpinnings of one of the most significant reforms in this or any other city's politics, the public financing system overseen by the Campaign Finance Board. We gather tonight to do what amounts to a pre-mortem, looking back at the campaign and ahead of Election Day. We are joined by Evelyn Hernandez, the editorial page editor of El Diario La Prensa, which today, the day of this taping, or whatever the digital equivalent of taping is, endorsed Ferrer. Era Lewis is a political columnist for the New York Daily News, and John Mollenkoff is the distinguished professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. Evelyn, El Diario endorsed Ferrer today. Other papers have endorsed, the ones that have endorsed Bloomberg. Make the case for Freddie Ferrer.
Well, the case is, in fact, for Ferrer and not necessarily against Bloomberg. Bloomberg has been a good caretaker mayor, if you will. A lot of the trends, a lot of the pluses that you mentioned in your opening were trends already when Bloomberg took over as mayor, and the trends have continued, including the trend in crime. And if you really look at various different categories of crime, if you break it down, some people will argue, including Fernando Ferrer, that it's not as rosy a picture as is painted, but nevertheless, it is a positive on the mayor's behalf. As far as Ferrer's case, I think the fact that the mayor has taken from Ferrer's own playbook, and especially in the last couple of weeks, on several issues, on the housing issue and on a couple of other issues, tells us that Ferrer is the one who's putting out actually ideas that are broader and that are addressing the problems that still exist in this city. And I think Hurricane Katrina certainly pointed out that the two cities theme is not something that's foreign to us, foreign to this country, that it's still a reality for a lot of people, that and certainly in New York with the housing and the salary differences, it's clear that, and the fear, in fact, that's expressed by a lot of people is that the city is becoming a city of haves and have-nots, and that's just continued in the last 4 years.
Errol, I had a 9th grade geography teacher named Murray Kunkus who taught me two things. One was he took us to Alley Pond Park and showed us the terminal moraine of the Ice Age, which I recommend to everybody to go see. And the other thing he taught us was that rich or poor, it's good to have money. You've been covering politics for a long time. The Quinnipiac poll that came out today said that people, by a surprisingly small margin, said that they do think that the mayor has an unfair advantage. How do you analyze the role of money in this campaign?
Well, it's hard in some ways because what we're seeing has never happened in American history. You've never seen this level of spending. The mayor spent $76 million in 2001. He spent over $50 million so far. In addition to that, he's made over $100 million worth of contributions, many of which have sort of political connections to certain charities or community groups that have politically oriented programs. And so altogether, it's very possible that this mayor has spent $250 million pursuing this office. There's nothing even remotely comparable to that. I mean, he is spending at a level, when he's spending like $1 million, he spent $20 million so far on TV advertisement, like $1 million a week. For perspective, that's what you see in the closing days of a senatorial campaign of a big state like California or New York. So I think it's impossible to separate. I mean, look, the reality is Fernando Ferrer was leading Bloomberg in the polls every which way you can think of about 6 to 7 months ago. And that's when the spending hit. And those numbers basically flipped. And people don't buy advertisement for whether it's for soap or for cars or for a campaign for no reason. They do it because it works. And the coverage is saturation. I mean, CUNY TV is an exception, but you can't turn to any other almost any other channel tonight and every other night between now and November 8th without seeing at least one ad by Michael Bloomberg.
Just for perspective, Bob, I just want to mention that when you and I were at New York Newsday, those many years ago, and Ed Koch was running for re-election in 1989, I had a front page story in Newsday because Koch had spent this exorbitant amount of money, and the number was $7 million. So when you're looking at 50 million and counting, and 76 million in the last election, it really helps you to understand how in a relatively short amount of time, the amount of money that's being spent in New York City on the mayoral race has just, increased so dramatically, and it's been because of Michael Bloomberg.
And it's not just TV; it's every channel of communication you can imagine,
except for CUNY TV. Why not?
It's direct mail. It's automated telephone calls. It's having campaign staff members call every registered voter in the city to determine their leaning, and making a database of everyone who tells the caller that they lean in favor of the mayor, and they'll use that to galvanize their vote on election day. Spanish language media, radio, print, I mean, you name it, it's papered wall to wall.
Do you think that the money is the only reason that Ferrer has not been able to gain traction?
No, but it's definitely a weight on the balance. It's a heavy weight to overcome. And if whatever Freddie's weaknesses as a candidates are, or even what his strengths are that are not getting out to the people, if you're on a teeter-totter and the other end of it has already got an extra 200-pound weight on it, it's going to be hard to make that teeter-totter go back and forth.
Incumbency is already a tremendous advantage to be the incumbent. I mean, people, unless the incumbent has made serious mistakes or just has promised to do something and has not come through, something major, people have a tendency to favor the incumbent. So that's already a great advantage that the mayor has.
I'm not so sure that they tend to favor the incumbent, but that re-election bids tend to be plebiscites on the incumbent.
Absolutely,
that's a fair statement. But for certain important political organizations in the city, incumbency does matter quite a bit. So DC 37, one of the most active political organizations, their political arm, I should say, is one of the most active in the city, or can be. They've endorsed the mayor. And DC 37 pretty much always endorses the incumbent. This is their employer. This is somebody they have to make a deal with. This is somebody who's going to determine their work conditions and so forth. And so by endorsing the mayor, they don't necessarily give him anything he really needs, but they deny those resources to Fernando Ferrer.
And the Bloomberg campaign was successful in organizing major Democratic donors, people who regularly give to Democratic candidates, to boycott the Ferrer campaign.
Mr. Ratner, I believe, is the one who's been quoted in the paper, right?
He's one. So, I mean, it's not only that he has so much money to spend, it's that anybody with any kind of significant business in front of government is going to say, how much risk do I undergo if I support Ferrer versus, maybe it's just easier to go along.
Well, I'm not sure I'm not sure that that's very different with other mayors. I mean, in this case, you can't give money to this mayor, but in many previous elections, under Giuliani and stuff, I think people in the Giuliani administration watched very closely who was giving money to the Democratic opponents. So, except for the fact that you can't give the money to the mayor because he's got, more money than half the countries in the world, I'm not sure that aspect is particularly different.
18 months ago, the mayor was really down in the polls compared to any candidate that he was put up against in a horse race. And he was coming out of a recession. He was coming out of an 18.5% property tax increase. He was coming out of banning smoking from bars, things that were unpopular with people. And they were very wise, I think, to do the difficult things well in advance of the election. And I said at the time that he was going to be able to move his numbers up steadily if he focused his mind on doing that, and we shouldn't take this low rating of him as being a prediction of what would come around at election time. And lo and behold, I think that they very deliberately, step by step, well before the overt campaign began, had a strategy of what to do to bring this mayor's numbers back. The rebates, the meetings in all of the outer borough communities where people had said that they don't particularly feel comfortable with this guy or wouldn't want to have Thanksgiving dinner with him or whatever. They did a very deliberate and steady and effective job in repairing whatever breaches there were in the support. You've really got to admire what they did. And on the other hand, this is well before the campaign has really begun, and Freddie had first to run and win a primary. So the Democrats on their side are not focused on this long-term positioning of themselves in the same way that the mayor was. And I think that people who are politics watchers realize the fact that the economy's recovering, the indicators for the city are basically good. It's hard to point to where the mayor has done a bad job, a terribly controversial job.
Except 6 months ago, this city was consumed with a debate over West Side development and the stadium, and that was an albatross around the mayor's neck politically.
Sure. Precisely, and the fact that he spent so much time trying to get the West Side Stadium built, and really didn't spend enough time, in a lot of people's eyes, working on the Lower Manhattan development and what was going to happen there. He hasn't spent money that the city has in hand to enhance security. They've spent money on consultants, but that's about it. And also should probably have been more had been more aggressive about confronting Washington, confronting the Republican president, and for security monies and other monies, and also confronting the governor for city needs around the MTA and other issues. So he spent so much time on the West Side Stadium and on the Olympic bid. Not necessarily a bad idea, the Olympic bid, but nevertheless, that was time that wasn't spent on other issues that are nearer and dearer to many people's hearts.
The president's a Republican, governor's a Republican, the mayor is sort of a Republican. Mr. Ferrer, in the waning days of the campaign, is bringing in a lot of national Democratic figures to try to basically try to link Bloomberg with an unpopular president and a sort of unpopular governor. Is that a Hail Mary pass? Does it make sense? Does it work?
It is a Hail Mary pass. It's very hard to make the connection. I mean, Michael Bloomberg is the #1 funder of, he's made the largest contributions to the National Republican Party and to President Bush, who's enormously unpopular in New York City for a number of different reasons. But
substance for one.
But it's very hard to sort of make the case to people unless they're really immersed in politics that if you don't like George Bush, this mayor is funding it. Therefore, he shouldn't be the mayor. That's a couple more steps than you can normally do in a short campaign commercial.
Except that you've seen the mayor come out against the nomination of Mr. Roberts to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. You've seen him in a series of criticisms of the national administration, and now he's as we do this taping or digital taping, whatever we do, in a bit of a spat with the governor over control of development at Lower Manhattan. All of a sudden, he's standing up to these people to some degree that he didn't do.
Well, that's right. I mean, he's certainly gotten. I think it's safe to assume he's gotten a pass from the White House on breaking with the administration on certain issues. He doesn't come out and attack President Bush. I think giving $8 or $9 million will probably buy you a lot of tolerance. And so once in a while he'll sort of break with the administration on certain issues, and the rest of the time he's and
on the gun bill is the other one that he went after them on, right?
In a lot of cases he pulls what I would call a disappearing trick. He just kind of says, "Look, I'm not really with them." You know, like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It's like these are just people who happen to belong to the same party as me. You know, I happen to have written them a bunch of big checks, but don't take that personally. I'm still going to run the schools and give you the housing and the public safety and the other basic items that you need. Now, is it fair for a voter to sort of weigh those and decide, you know what, I don't care what he does with, you know, I don't care where he sends his checks. You know, I wish the war in Iraq wasn't happening. I wish this president wasn't here. On the other hand, I like what he's doing with the schools. I mean, those are the kind of questions, if we had a real vigorous, even-handed debate, that would be in front of the voters for them to decide. The problem, of course, is the money. So it's really like an avalanche, all in one direction, sort of saying, this is the mayor who's working on the schools and the housing and the jobs and everything else. And these larger national questions about the war, about stem cell research, about other things that the national Republicans are pursuing that really a lot of New Yorkers just really don't like, it's not really become part of the campaign. It hasn't taken root.
But I think behind Bob's question is the point that partisanship probably and party membership means less to New Yorkers, at least in mayoral elections over time. And many Democrats have shown a willingness to vote for Republican candidates in a number of circumstances. And the Democratic Party doesn't have the kind of reach to the grassroots. It's not galvanizing people.
How much of that is because when you have a 5-to-1 edge, you really don't have any party? I mean, it's such a large majority that it's in essence meaningless. I mean, you know, if you have a 5-to-1 edge, you basically have 3 parties. You know, your factions become their own.
But at the mayoral level, we've had very competitive elections for a long time. Maybe the other elections aren't competitive, and so in those forums, you know, the party is not very well organized.
We've really had 2 competitive elections, though. We've had 1993 when Giuliani beat Dinkins, and 2001
was very competitive.
And 89 was competitive. In 2001, when I would argue that Michael Bloomberg wasn't elected, that people voted against Mark Green, and Michael Bloomberg was credible enough to be the alternative. There have been years when Republican candidates were not credible enough to be an alternative.
Including many Hispanics who voted for Bloomberg in 2001 because they were so unhappy with the way that Mark Green and the Democratic Party, not just Mark Green, but the Democratic Party had treated Ferrer and in terms of the party, that the party had not moved quickly or decisively to condemn, if you will, the actions or the suspected actions of the Green campaign. So those folks voted for Bloomberg in 2001. Perhaps you know, are more inclined to vote for him again in 2005.
It's very hard to say what the Democratic Party stands for or means within the 5 boroughs. I mean, you have Democrats who also run on the Conservative Party line. You have other Democrats who also run on the Working Families Party line. There are some Democrats who are anti-abortion. There are some Democrats who are in favor of gay marriage.
Yeah, but you could say the same thing about Republicans. You can say the same thing about Republicans. Yes, you can.
Not Republican office holders in New York. Well, maybe 1 or 2.
I think you can. I mean, I think parties inherently are, you know, I mean, you could say it statewide, you could say it nationally. The Republican Party has pro-choice people. They have, you know, I don't know if they have anti-war people, but they have, but I mean, I think there's, you know, a bit of a, it may not be the biggest tent, but there is some breadth.
You know what the real difference is, as far as I can see, is that there's a principle of coming together under a big tent that Republicans actually talk about, you know, and they sort of follow. You know, so George Bush is right now at the lowest approval ratings of his presidency, 39% or something like that. He'd be in absolute free fall. He'd be on his way out of office. He'd be paralyzed were it not for the fact that 84% of Republicans still support him. And he's made all kinds of missteps. I mean, there's the war, there's the Harriet Miers nomination, there's the corruption scandal that's brewing in the administration itself, and 8.5 out of 10 Republicans are saying he's still the guy, we're not going to break ranks. You compare that with Democrats where, you know, and frankly, Ferrer can't complain too loudly about it this time because he broke ranks last time, you know, whether justified or not. There was this big, enormous split. Some of it broke down along ethnic lines last time when he got into this runoff with Mark Green. So unless there's party discipline, unless the party says, you know what, there is an 11th commandment. This is Ronald Reagan used to talk about this. The 11th commandment, he said, was thou shalt not criticize another Republican. The Democrats have nothing even resembling that. You know,
No,
in fact,
they do their firing squad in the circle. Right.
that's exactly right. In fact, I talked to John Kerry the other day. I interviewed him, and I said, you know, don't you worry about this? The fact that there's no loyalty, there's all these defections here in New York and so forth. And he said, look, there's never been a lot of party discipline. That's part of who we are as Democrats. It shows a commitment to free speech and free thought, and in a funny way, it's actually one of our strengths. And I came away from that thinking, you look, in a not so funny way, it's actually one of your weaknesses. You know, I mean, you're not going to get the results that you want as a party if there isn't some kind of bottom line that says, you know what, once the primary is over, once the faction fight is over, what we're going to do is the basic job of any party, which is to go out and get the ticket elected.
Well, at least nominally, in the aftermath of this primary, with Congressman Weiner saying, I'm not going to contest the runoff when he was, you know, within a couple of hundred votes of being able to hold him below hold Ferrer below the 40%. I think I've never seen, at least nominally, at least on the surface, seen the Democratic Party with less incrimination, with less recriminations in-house in the immediate aftermath of the primary. And you've had a lot of Democratic defections, but, you know, you raised the question of ethnicity. And, you know, I have the sense that, you know, I personally think that the polls that show that Bloomberg might get 44% of the Hispanic Latino vote seems too high. I mean, to what degree is, you know, we all remember David Dinkins' election in 1989, which was in large part driven by history of the first African-American mayor, the first minority mayor. It seems to me this year that even with history driving Ferrer's campaign, that race and ethnicity is a factor, but not the factor that it was in the past.
Right. In 2001, somehow the fact that Ferrer is Puerto Rican and had had a chance of becoming the first Latino mayor, that seemed to have more traction, and people seem to be more fired up about that in 2001. And Ferrer did a better job of firing people up, I think, about that in 2001. It is a factor this time around, and it's an important factor, and one that we mentioned in the editorial, and also in terms of the party, I think we also took our hats off to Weiner for his gesture, because it was an important gesture that helped to pull the party together. In fact, I think those of us who follow campaigns knew that Ferrer would get the 40%, that the numbers would break that way, but I think that it's important to remember that there are still a lot of X factors with Ferrer's campaign, even 2 weeks out. One is that Puerto Ricans around the nation, and if you've studied the Puerto Rican community, you know there are Puerto Ricans everywhere in this country, are mobilizing. People are coming from Boston, from Philadelphia, from the small Midwestern cities that Puerto Ricans went to in the 50s to work in the in industry there and in manufacturing. People are going to come to New York to help to mobilize people and to get them to the polls on election day, and from Puerto Rico as well. So that's an element that we're not sure of. And you know, the numbers will show, and Ferrer's numbers from 2001 are interesting to look at too, that Hispanics may say, oh, you know, I won't vote for somebody just because he's Latino, and that's true to a certain extent. You want to vote for a good candidate, but all things being equal, when they get behind that curtain, they'll pull the lever for the Hispanic, because if all things are equal, and in this race they are for the most part, except for the big imbalance of the money. You have two candidates who are comparable at this point now that Bloomberg has 4 years of being mayor under his belt. People will vote, and Ferrer has historically pulled 80% plus of the Latino vote.
Let me just tell one very quick story, and I want to go to John. In 1961, when Wagner was running for his third term, he was on the Republican line, was I believe Louis Lefkowitz, who was the state attorney general, and we had never had a Jewish mayor, and I'm Jewish, and I went with my father into the polling booth, and he said, shh, don't tell your mother, and he voted for Lefkowitz. And then I went in with my mother, and she said, don't tell your father, and she voted for Lefkowitz. so I do think that there's something that there is something to it. You know, when you talking about people coming in and the focus on the haves and the have-nots, excuse me, Ferrer has kind of re-upped his theme of two cities, and in the most recent Quinnipiac poll I've seen, people were asked, do you agree that there are two cities? and a small majority said yes, we think he's right, that there are two cities. And then they were asked the question, do you think he's being divisive by bringing it up? And by a plurality, they said yes, we think he's divisive. In other words, we agree with what he's saying, but we think he's divisive in bringing it up. I mean, how do you read that? I think it's one of the more interesting findings.
Well, you know, let's say 1.8 million people will vote. That's just a guess. Out of 8 million people who live in New York City. And who are those 1.8 million people? They're obviously voting age citizens. They're obviously registered to vote, but they'll tend to be better educated people, people with more income, more likely to own their home and so forth. So that the people in the active electorate are not the same as the people who live in the city, or even the people who could theoretically vote if they bothered to register and turn out. So it's inevitable that the competition for the vote starts to revolve around the interests of the people who are most likely to vote, and to ignore the interests of people who are less likely to vote.
Yeah, I read that poll finding as a reflection of the etiquette around class. And the etiquette around class, in America generally and in New York in particular, is that you don't talk about it. You don't talk about it too much.
We talk about race when actually the issue is class, in essence.
Well, yeah, we don't talk that much about race in New York City either. I mean, look, here's two facts. New York City is the third most segregated city in America.
Residentially.
Yes, after Detroit and Milwaukee. And we think of ourselves as this cosmopolitan city, and we see everybody, you know, we share the sidewalks and the trains with all kinds of people, and then we go home to segregated enclaves every single night. It's something that I wish more people would talk about.
That's segregated in the black-white sense. It's not so segregated in the white Latino or the Latino Asian or the Asian white sense.
It's there's still Latinos are segregated in a lot of areas of this city.
Well,
I mean, it applies to the Latino communities as well.
But let's talk about class. More than 1 in 5 New Yorkers is living in poverty, and that's $292.40 per week for a family of 3. Okay, that's a lot of people. That's almost 2 million people, and we don't talk about that. Right. I mean, in fact, if you bring it up, as Ferrer is discovering, there are a lot of other people who say, "Look, what are you bringing this up for?" Mm-hmm. Because if you talk about it long enough, 1 in 5 people. Think about 1 in 5 people on the next time you take a train. How many people that is who are living in a situation most of us would properly consider an emergency of the highest order. How are you going to feed 3 people on $292 a week? So people don't like to be reminded of that, because sooner or later, the idea that they might have to do something about it is going to be introduced, that they might have to pay more in taxes, that they might have to care, that they might have to stop watching TV so much every night. You know, that the vision of New York that you see in Friends and in Seinfeld and in Woody Allen movies, where it's basically this playground for the white middle class, that maybe that's not New York, that maybe there's something else going on. Maybe we have the highest percentage of people living in poverty of any major city in America, and that the rate has increased in each of the 4 years. I mean, this is real stuff. Is it a reason to throw Bloomberg out? Not necessarily, but is it something we should talk about? Absolutely. And the fact that Ferrer is going to get consistently gets trashed for even bringing it up. He's called divisive. You know, I mean, it's like he's being called divisive for saying that the sky is blue. But a lot of people feel differently. It will make the next candidate that much more.
A lot of people in newspapers feel differently.
Well, a lot of people in newspaper are not living on $292.40 a week. But I think it will make it harder for the next candidate to try and bring up these issues, and so it buries this question of class under one more layer of sediment, which is really too bad.
And Ferrer has actually labeled it. He finally found a label for it, for the fact that we are ignoring this. And he, of course, in terms of the campaign, he says that Bloomberg specifically is ignoring this. He calls it happy talk. He says all this happy talk about the schools and the crime and the trains, and we're not talking about the fact that, you know, that 20% and that increased recently. You know, that fully 20% of the people in New York are living in poverty, and that people can't find a place to live. That people are have to leave the city that middle class people have to leave the city in order to find a reasonable place to live, etc. So he's actually come up with a label for it. But you know, unfortunately, you're right. It's a tough issue. It's not pleasant, and people would rather just not talk about it, and as long as we continue to do that, it will continue to be an issue. Unfortunately, it's just not getting discussed fully in this campaign because people prefer to hear what the mayor. A lot of people prefer to hear what the mayor is telling them.
It's a bad partisan reference, but it's the elephant in the room. Yes, sir.
I am Jason Schaff from Brooklyn College. Mayor Bloomberg's been portrayed very favorably in the media. Issues such as the Westside Stadium and the Olympic bid, once they were ruled out, they basically stopped being an issue. Also, the rebuilding Ground Zero hasn't really taken the forefront as an issue yet. And basically, I think it should be because, it's been such a failure there. With Bloomberg, Pataki, and battles with Larry Silverstein and so on. Is Bloomberg's lead in the polls attributable to this or the fact that Ferrer's miscues have taken him so far down in the polls?
Let's beat up the media. Always great. Yes. Why did you start?
Well, on Ground Zero, really, it's the governor who controls all the major agencies, and if anybody should be taking brickbats over Ground Zero, it's the governor, not the mayor.
But he's asking about the way that the campaign has been portrayed to the general public, which is in essence through the media.
Well, I think that the media follow to some degree both the polls and what powerful elites are thinking and telling the media about how the election is going to go, and then what the content of the media influences public opinion rather than the other way around. And the mayor has done an excellent job. Well, first of all, the mayor's done a good job on the whole, I think, and so that's a fundamental difficulty that any challenger faces in giving people a reason to toss the guy out.
Because it is in essence, plebiscite on the incumbent.
It is.
In any re-election bid, right?
But over and above that, people, the news media have to think. Well, do we want to cross this mayor? Do we want to really take him on? What will we get out of that? The media are businesses, and they have a lot of matters in front of city government themselves, and I think that the editorial side and the business side probably would think a few times before saying we really want to take out and go against a successful incumbent mayor.
Strategically, one of the questions that you do have to make in the media is, do you want to fight a crusade that Ferrer has chosen not to fight? Ferrer did not define his candidacy on day one as that mess down at Ground Zero is partly the mayor's fault. There's definitely a case for that. He has appointees to the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. He has been relatively silent. His deputy mayor, Dan Doctoroff, said that it would make sense for the city to be the, quote, junior partner on the development of the World Trade Center.
Well, they chose to deal with the West Side rather than Lower Manhattan.
Right, and that is not a decision that any mayor that I can think of, any of our great mayors certainly. Can you imagine Giuliani making such a decision? Even Dinkins wouldn't have said, well, New York City is going to just kind of take a backseat role on the greatest crisis that has ever struck this city in its history. But Bloomberg did make that decision. It could have been a controversial decision. It's not something the press was going to do, in part because it wasn't clear that things were being mismanaged down there until fairly recently. We started looking up. It's like, hey, this is year 4, and there's still a big hole in the ground. And then the families helped focus a lot of that attention as well. But then also you have to acknowledge that the Ferrer campaign has not tried to make this a political issue in this campaign.
In terms of the media, I think it's important, and to come back to the issue of Bloomberg and his money. I've been to Bloomberg's headquarters and I've been to Ferrer's headquarters, and Bloomberg's campaign headquarters are much nicer. And one of the
looks like Star Trek.
One of the factors is that because he has more money and because he's not participating in the campaign finance program, Bloomberg has a staff of people who collect information and then release it strategically into the media. And they call it, we call it negative campaigning. They call it pushback campaigning. But, for example, they found out early in September that there was some incorrect information on Ferrer's website. They leaked it. They held that information and gave it to the media, and they did, in fact, give it to the media about 2 to 3 weeks later, because that's when it was convenient for them for the media to get it. So when you have money and you have a staff and you're not participating in the campaign finance program, despite that as mayor, you're technically overseeing that program, then you can also control the media to a certain extent. They've certainly been expert at it. He has also controlled the situations where he appears or where he speaks. When he's holding a press conference at City Hall or on city business, he's the mayor. He's in charge of that press conference, whether we like to concede that point or not. And in terms of the debates, he did not participate in the debate in Harlem, even though that was a campaign finance sponsored debate, because he would have it wasn't a controlled setting. And the debates that he is going to participate in are debates in television studios without an audience. So he is controlling the message, very much so.
Yes, sir. Your question.
Hi, good evening. My name is Murtajir Rahman. I'm from Queens College. Going back to Bloomberg spending so much money in the campaign, I find it absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing. $76 million in last election and over 50 in this election, in this campaign so far. My question is, what do the panelists think what is the political motive, perhaps, behind, running for such, is it just being rich and famous? I mean, you're spending so much money, and I don't think he takes any salary. I think he just takes $1 per year. $1 per year. That'd be great. Thank you.
Bloomberg's motto is bring a gun to a knife fight. He lives by that credo, and that's, I think he's brought a cannon to this, or several cannons.
Phasers.
Phasers, yes, that's even more appropriate to this campaign. His reasoning last time was that people didn't know who he was. And this time, I'm not sure if he's even justified it, but it seems that he really wants to be mayor again.
I also hear the question as, what is this guy? He's worth $5 billion. Why does he want to be mayor in the first place? And I think that's an interesting question. I mean, my analysis of it is that if you go into a restaurant and there's some rich person from industry that nobody's ever heard of, he's just one more rich guy who basically has to wait online like everybody else. I mean, you can maybe bribe the maitre d' with $20, but I could do that too. To be the mayor of New York, you come in, you get a very different treatment. Your scene is very different. I think one of the things, it's one of these other things that doesn't get talked about right after race and class, is the role of ego in the leadership of New York. There are people, if you actually talk with a billionaire, not just the mayor, but there are others who are out there, you meet some of these business titans, you meet some of these people who run the big institutions, and they exist on food, water, and ego, and not necessarily in that order. There are some people who really, really like to be stroked, who really, really have a sense of entitlement, who feel like anybody would, that, hey, you know what, I can make decisions, I can run the show.
Except that, how long have you covered politics? 1983, in various forms. Have you ever known somebody who ran for mayor, or governor, or president, or senator who wasn't motivated by a very large ego? No. I mean, so I think that I think the ego is a given in people who run for office, and ambition is a given in people who run for office. And I personally think the mayor saw this as an incredible challenge. I mean, what city could be more interesting than New York? I mean, I think it's a fascinating challenge. I mean, it's not like he wanted to take his money and go to one of his houses in Bermuda or London or Westchester or wherever, or Aspen or wherever else he has a house. I think he saw it as an incredible intellectual challenge.
He himself said that right. He was going to either try to become the mayor of New York or the head of the World Bank, and I forget what the third one, President of the United States. Right, and he said, well, two of those are taken, President of the United States and head of the World Bank, so the third was New York. So it was a process of elimination.
But I can't, I'm trying to think of what, the only person I know who's ego-free is me. So. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Mary Panisi from Brooklyn College. You mentioned that the disparity between the incomes of New Yorkers have drastically widened under Bloomberg's mayorship. And I was wondering, how do you think the fading middle class will vote in this election? Which candidate will they favor, and which candidate will they recognize to be serving their interests?
You want to jump on that?
Well,
I also think, by the way, that so many people think they're in the middle class who really are not, but that's a separate point.
there's there's definitely a strong class bias in how people vote, and the better off you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. I'm not sure just exactly how we would define fading middle class. Let's say a family of 3 or 4 that has an income around $50,000 a year. That as just a kind of a rough guess. I'm thinking that those people would vote their aspirations to be more upper class than their fears that they're going to fall into the lower class for the most part.
Yeah. I think a huge difference also is whether that person already owns their home or is trying to buy a home. I mean, people trying to enter this housing market face astonishing barriers, while somebody who bought their home 12 years ago, 15 years, 20 years ago is land rich. They may not have, they may not have any cash in their pocket, but they're equity rich.
There are two factors that are interesting. When you talk about class, it very much is subjective, and it is a psychological kind of, it's a state of mind. Studies have suggested that people down to a shockingly low level, I mean, I'd say almost just above homeless, think of themselves as middle class. On the other hand, there are people who are making $250,000 who think of themselves as middle class. And obviously they're doing drastically differently depending on what their real situations are. The other factor is, and I think this is familiar to everybody, is very much as you say, your hopes and not your fears. Everybody thinks someday they can be a millionaire or a billionaire. And it doesn't matter how many statistics that you throw at them and say you are more likely to go to the moon, literally, than become a billionaire. People will still sort of, buy the lotto ticket and kind of subscribe to it. It's part of actually one of the things that makes us American. There's this optimism. People have been writing about it for over 100 years. What that means, though, for the mayor is I think a lot of people identify with the mayor. I mean, think back to when he first came into office and informed the city and the press that he was not going to tell anybody when he left the city. If he felt like getting on his private jet and flying to his home in Bermuda for the weekend, nobody in the city needed to know. It's none of their business. It's his money. It's his house. It's his jet. It's his time. And most New Yorkers, when you polled, they said, yeah. And most people sort of identified with that. Nobody owns a jet. Nobody has a house in Bermuda. And people just sort of naturally said, and I think the psychological process is, well, heck, if I had all that money, that's exactly what I would do. And that's one of the hidden strengths that the mayor has going for him going into this election. And again, nobody likes to talk about it.
Be like Mike.
If I can interject something here. To me, this mayor has been the most pro-development mayor of any that I've experienced since moving here in 1980. If you look at the upzoning of the West Side, if you look at the upzoning of the Brooklyn waterfront, if you look at the Atlantic Terminal project, he is fostering in the next, say, 10 years, probably the construction of 100 or more 50-story towers in New York City, that many of which will be residential. Think of the impacts both on the West Side. Well, not so many people live there, so maybe the impact will not be as great, but think of the impact of building those high-rises along the East River waterfront in Greenpoint, Williamsburg. It's just going to totally transform that place. And he's done it, he's proposed this all over. At the same time, there's been some down zonings.
But yet he has tried to do inclusionary housing, inclusionary
zoning. He came late to
and
inclusionary housing.
Well, he came late to the housing plan, and you made the point that he ripped off, to some degree, Ferrer's housing plan. I'm not sure there's anything wrong with ripping off a good idea.
No, but he did rip it off. His proposal at the beginning of the campaign was for a much lower number of affordable housing, and that's one area where he doubled or tripled it to match Ferrer's proposal, because Ferrer's proposal is for more affordable housing. That emerged as a big issue in this campaign, and he focused on it early.
John, I also want to, in some of the rezoning, particularly the Brooklyn waterfront and some other areas in Long Island City and stuff, I would argue that what he's done is rationalized the land use map, and that because absent the rezoning, what you would have seen is, I still believe you would have seen those developments going up. They would have been done piecemeal. They would have been done through a Board of Standards and Appeals, system, which is not in any rational way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think there's an argument that I think some of the stuff he's done in the, I hate saying the outer boroughs, being a Brooklyn boy, I find it a very offensive term, but the other boroughs, in some ways has actually rationalized the land use map, and it's very much an example of Bloomberg as manager. Not Bloomberg as visionary, but Bloomberg as just kind of brass tacks manager. Let me take try to get some more questions in.
Hello, my name is Bonnie Doohan, and I'm from John Jay College. And my question, well, actually, media is a bipartisan, or should be a bipartisan, and just report.
Nonpartisan, actually.
Nonpartisan, and report to the public. And recently, New York Newsday and The Times has endorsed Bloomberg. Also, on another note, the Post is usually putting Ferrer in a negative light. So most people who buy the Post, cater to a certain class or race, and also people who buy Newsday and Times also cater to the same thing. So how can people talk about real issue when the media is bought by Bloomberg?
Well, I do think that one of the benefits you have in New York City is that you have 4 newspapers, 5 if you count the New York Sun, 6 if you count El Diario, 7 if you count Hoy, 8 and 9 if you throw in some of the, if you throw in foreign language papers, you've got 20. Of course, I don't, being a real New Yorker, I don't consider Spanish to be a foreign language. But I mean, and I think it's incumbent upon you to read as many of those papers as you can and filter it through your own brain. Having said that, I think she makes a very good point about and I also think you have to separate church and state, the editorial page from what's covered in the news sections. Do papers do a good job of that? Does the bias of the newspaper's editorial board leak into the coverage?
I could say, as a member of the Daily News editorial board, we have no influence whatsoever on the news coverage. I mean, as much as we would like to.
As a former reporter there, I feel the same way. I mean, I've never felt that pressure.
But there does tend to emerge among reporters who are covering a given figure. There's a somewhat of a consensus emerges among the reporters about is this person got what it takes to make a race, or are they a dud?
Yeah. But that's different than an editorial board influence.
Different.
Right?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. That's the real bias.
That's the Room 9 bias. The social dynamic.
Yeah. Room 9 is where all the reporters at City Hall work, and
which
they
was
follow
once
the
the
mayor
court
around
for the
every day.
criminally insane, by the way, back in the 1870s.
There is a pack journalism that evolves, and also when you start to get the perception that one person is emerging as the inevitable winner, the inevitable victor, I think that the coverage starts to lean that way, or sometimes the coverage pushes it in that direction. Sometimes it's hard to tell which came first, but we actually did an editorial about a month ago taking the English language media to task because there had been a whole series in the different newspapers, but also on television, a whole series of unfair articles on Ferrer, and in the case of the Post, very offensive and racist cartoons that they had used in 2001 of Ferrer and Reverend Al Sharpton and resurrected for this campaign. So we felt that we needed to take a position just on, this is bad journalism and we need to speak out on it, regardless of who you think is the better candidate.
It's not clear why or how it happens, but I would say that at least 6 months ago, Ferrer effectively lost the press primary. I mean, that among the people who, and there's not more than, 50 people who really cover politics day to day and have collectively a very, very large audience. They work together. Many of them are married. I mean, I'm part of this pack, so I sort of know kind of what goes on with it. And the people ruled out Ferrer out of hand. I mean, it was not conceivable to them that this guy could be the mayor.
People were convinced that there would be a runoff, that there was no way he would get 40% of the vote in the primary, and that that a runoff was inevitable. I mean, and that started coming through in the coverage when there was just a strong indications that if the polls said he had 36% of the vote, that he probably did have the 40%, because polls inevitably don't do a very good job of measuring the Hispanic community.
Yeah, let me just. I do want to go to a couple of more questions. I'm bugged by my own use of the word foreign language before, because the degree to which English and Spanish are not foreign languages in a city of this complexity. Neither is Russian and Hindi and Chinese and Creole, and so let me correct myself before anybody jumps on me. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, To Kenya Webb, John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Earlier, Ms. Hernandez, you suggested that there has been a strategic flow of information into the media by the mayor to benefit his campaign. Do you believe that the recent terrorist threats to the New York City subway was an example of this, being that it was so close to the scheduled debate?
How can I answer that? I think it was definitely a question that needed to be asked, and I think the media asked it, and I think the mayor has answered it. I mean, he said no. He said we got the information again. But in speaking of strategically leaking information, the Harlem debate, the fact that he did not participate in the Harlem debate, and then this question over the terrorist threat. Those were the first instances where Bloomberg was questioned or criticized, basically in the campaign, I think, where he received serious kind of criticism in the case of the Harlem debate and questioning in the case of the terrorist threat. And they weren't happy about it. I mean, they were very uneasy and uncomfortable. It was an unfamiliar position for him to be in. But the question also comes up again because when they were questioned about the timing, what they did was they then leaked the fact that certain people had gotten word in advance that this terrorist threat was out there. It was in fact the Bloomberg administration that released that information to the media.
Is that right?
So again,
Wow.
they released that information because he was getting questioned about it.
My personal opinion is no. I mean, my personal opinion is that, just knowing Michael Bloomberg and knowing Ray Kelly in particular, I mean, I just find that, if they played politics with that, it's an astonishing condemnation, and I just don't believe it.
On the other hand, it worked to their advantage. They may not have gone into it to seek that effect, but it did help the mayor.
See, I think the role of a skeptical press is to assume the worst. I was taught this a long time ago. I'm sort of old school. You figure out what's the worst thing a politician could do, and then imagine that they did
I've
do
read
it.
some of that stuff.
Well,
I've worked with you on some of those stories.
I learned it from you.
Or at least ask them about it.
And right, at least ask. And so I don't, and it's a very fine distinction to make, but look, I don't want to believe that something like that would happen, that there's that level of wag the dog kind of, sinister manipulation going on. But I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask. And I think to put the question off limits is the real problem.
And
no question is off limits.
There's certainly people in the press office of any campaign who will take advantage of any darn thing that comes down the pike to manage the news cycle. That's their job, and they're very.
I just think this one is outside the normal cycle of exploiting the insecurities of the press, which we never believe really happened. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. My name is Zoje Atto, and I'm from the College of John Jay. And my question is, Mayor Bloomberg has set up programs like 311 and the reformation of the Board of Education to the Department of Education. Do you think that Freddie Ferrer will match his progress?
I just think that the mayor's use of technology in particular, that he has a unique orientation towards technology that probably helped push 311 into, but I mean, what are the, what would you look for in a Ferrer administration that would be as dramatic as, let's say, dumping the board of election and the Board of Education and creating a new Department of Education?
Well, that was very dramatic, and in fact, that had been in the works for a long time and was already in the works.
Dating back to Koch, it was.
But was in the works under the Giuliani administration, to be specific, before Bloomberg came into office. So I think I'm not sure that I see something as dramatic as the mayor taking control of the Board of Ed. I do believe Ferrer's commitment to attacking the dropout rate, especially since it affects Black and Latinos, you know, much more dramatically. But you know, it affects everybody in New York City. I mean, the dropout rate in New York City in general is high. It affects
And
all.
it's very much a class issue again,
Exactly.
more than it is really just a race and
Exactly.
a race and ethnicity issue.
Right, and I think that his housing plan and his plan to get people who qualify for health insurance, for example, and don't realize it and aren't in those health insurance programs. But I think those are the areas where he would make dramatic gains. I think that's where his concern is and where his heart is really. And let's not forget that Fernando Ferrer was a leader in the reconstruction of and the rebuilding of the South Bronx, and a lot of that involved working with local, state, and federal government. And I see that his housing plan, that includes the plan for affordable housing, is in line with that, and he would continue that as well on a citywide basis.
Yeah. John, we only have a couple of minutes left. I mean, what are the great tasks, either for a Fernando Ferrer or for a re-elected Michael Bloomberg? What's the areas of attack on city problems, briefly?
You mean
How's that for a
the
brief
agenda,
question? Yeah.
1 or 2 year agenda after this coming January, whatever it is when the
January
mayor
1st.
gets sworn in? Well, you know, I do think the question that was brewing under the Giuliani administration has to be asked again now that the economy of the city is coming back. Prosperity for whom? Or how do we share the prosperity in the city? How do we make sure that all the successes of the city and the firms and the executives in the city pay off, you know, for the person in the middle, for the person at the bottom? And that hasn't been something that we've talked about very much. But really, a mayor who cares about transforming the city, I think, has to pay attention to that question.
I think there's some
30 seconds.
The equivalent of termites eating away at the foundations of the city, and it includes some of that inequality. It also includes some of the hidden costs of government. There are soaring pension costs. There's a Medicaid budget that is a time bomb. It's a ticking time bomb. It is going to limit choices severely for education and everything else in the coming years. Whoever becomes the mayor starting next year is going to have to start addressing some of those.
We only have about 30 seconds left. Who's going to run in 2009?
I heard Marty Markowitz might be running. That would be an interesting prospect. But there's no shortage of people who want power, so I think we'll see a very crowded field.
Does that, very, very quickly, a couple of seconds, are there some Democrats here who are supporting Ferrer who would prefer to see him lose for their own purposes?
Well, yeah, right. The leading candidates are Billy Thompson, the Brooklyn-based controller of the city.
I just got the goodbye sign. I always try to make deadline, and I want to thank everybody for being here. And we will see you next time. We'll start analyzing the 2009 election. Thank you very much.